Hello and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. I have been studying relationships for over 20 years as a couples therapist, a professor, an award-winning author, and as a wife, mother, daughter, sister, and friend. Now, I'm inviting you into this space each week as I dig into some of the toughest and most fascinating relational dilemmas of our time. If you want to discover how to create vibrant and loving relationships in your own life, you have come to the right place. This is Reimagining Love. Hi there. Welcome back to Reimagining Love. I'm excited to share today's conversation because I got to totally nerd out with Dr. Allison Daminger about the division of labor in couples, particularly in an overlooked domain, the mental space. In her research, she found that even when couples approximate parity around time use, there are still huge gaps in what she calls mind use or cognitive labor, even for modern couples who believe in what she calls the myth of mutuality, an equal partnership where both partners are evenly sharing the load. Allison Daminger is an assistant professor of sociology at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's the author of the new book, What's on Her Mind? The Mental Workload of Family Life. Daminger's research focuses on how and why gender shapes family dynamics. So today you're going to hear about the gendered disparities in cognitive labor in the home, and you're going to hear about it in a gentle and blame-free way. And that's because when it comes to gender roles in family life, all of us tend to overestimate the effects of individual differences, and we underestimate the effects of bigger social forces. So if the load is feeling unequal in your partnership, Allison wants you to move away from guilt and blame and move toward strategies that help you actually align your ideals and your real life experience. So you're going to hear about what constitutes this cognitive labor that women tend to carry the lion's share of, and how that plays out at home and also has implications on women's well-being and women's ways of being out in the world. You're going to hear from the couples in Allison's research who have truly created an actually shared system around cognitive labor. And you're going to learn about the approaches and circumstances that led to that result. You'll hear about the storytelling that goes into why couples divide labor in the ways that they do, particularly in an effort to avoid recreating overly gendered divisions of labor while actually recreating them nonetheless. And you're going to hear how to recognize disparities when they're playing out and how you can bring this awareness to more fairly divide cognitive labor at home based on skill, not quote unquote personality, i.e. gendered expectations. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Allison Daminger. Allison, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about the conversation.
Oh, me too. Well, even though you are a badger and I'm a Wolverine at heart and now a wildcat, I'm still excited to get nerdy with you. You know, when I first heard about your book, I thought, oh, this is a topic that is so near and dear to my heart. And then I got your book and I was like, oh, she wrote a book that has 76 pages of methodological index and appendix and notes. I was like, oh, this is a lady after my own sweet nerdy heart. So I am so excited to unpack all of this with you.
I'm glad you appreciated that. I was when I received my copy of the book, I had this feeling like, oh my goodness, I put so much in the end notes, but I really wanted it to be able to speak to the folks who like to nerd out about the nitty-gritty details of conducting research, and for those who just want, to breeze through the main text, that's also a possibility.
Well, that's what I think is really impressive about it is, yes, you are clearly coming in as an academic and a researcher, but everything that you share with us is very, very accessible and applicable and strategic. And so you didn't lose us at all in the main body of the book. It was really so easy to stay with you as you talked us through this really important topic of what happens around labor within our homes.
That's wonderful feedback. That is exactly what I was going for. So thank you so much.
Good. Well, you did it. You did it. Okay, so before we can go into that, I want to ask you the question that we ask all of our guests. Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
Okay, Allison, how are you reimagining love in one of your important relationships these days?
So I am a mom to my first child who is now 5 months old. So that is a whole new type of love. I feel like it's goes beyond reimagining and just it's a whole different category. And that's also really meant some change and adjustment for my relationship with my husband, where both of us are now co-parents and we have this third person in our unit, and that is beautiful and exciting, and it's a lot sometimes. So we are having to navigate, well, what does it mean that it's a lot harder to get time for just the two of us? And what does it mean for us to have so many more of the logistics that I talk about in my research? And we're still, we're only 5 months in, so I'm hopeful that things will even out over time. But at the moment, it feels like a lot of transition for the two most important relationships I have right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there anything, any like really wonderful tips that you've gotten from people in your life or anything that you and your husband have discovered that is helping you as you deal with it? Right. I mean, it's definitely one of the most seismic transitions that a couple can go through. So anything that you can offer a listener who might be also like, oh, wait, me too.
Yeah. So, two things. One, we are working on just naming the fact that this is hard and new, and
Yeah.
we're in it
Yeah.
together. I think there's a tendency to just get caught up in survival mode and forget that we are a team. So reframing to be more of an us versus the challenging circumstances rather than I'm not sleeping, you're not sleeping, who needs more sleep? So trying to reframe in that way. And then, two, on a very practical level, we've been doing these date lunches. We have childcare during the day, and someone suggested, well, you don't have to be working full in for all of those 40 hours a week. You could dedicate one of those hours to connecting. And that has been something that we try to do most weeks, and feels like we're kind of getting away with something.
And there's nothing better than a date that feels a little bit naughty. Like that just adds a whole fun element. Like we totally should not be stepping away from all of this and just having lunch together. So that makes it even more connecting to be sort of naughty and subversive together. That's great.
Exactly.
Oh, good for you guys. Yeah, I feel like I spend a lot of time reminding couples that dates don't have to be Saturday evening with a dinner and that really does put constraints, especially in your phase of the journey. It really puts constraints on time together in a way that is not at all necessary. Like romantic and connecting and intimate is whatever the two of you decide that it is.
Yeah, and that gets back, I think, to your question of we are reimagining the ways that we connect. It's not quite
Right.
as easy, the traditional patterns. We are going to go away for a weekend. We are going to go out to a buzzy new restaurant. Those are less accessible, and so what does connection look like in this new phase? That's something that we're working through.
That's great. I was also thinking about just the power of each of you being able to say to the other, this is hard. And it's not the same amount of hard for both of you in every single moment. And it's not the same type of hard for each of you in any moment. But that ability to say, this is hard and we're together in the hard. It's such an antidote to that like kind of suffering Olympics that it's so incredibly easy to get into when you're keeping right when you're tracking who's slept and who's working and who's got the tighter deadline to just come back to this is hard for both of us.
Exactly. I think for us, the newborn not sleeping phase is where we found ourselves getting into that. Well, how many hours did you get and how rested are you? And we're the answer is that neither of us got as much as
No,
we need or want. And
no.
so it's like, how can we support each other through this hard bit?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that gives us a really nice segue to the topic of your brand new book. Because somehow, in the midst of all of this, producing a little baby into the world, you also are producing a book out into the world. So, congratulations. You've written a book called What's on Her Mind: The Mental Workload of Family Life. And what you're inviting us to look at is the fact that we traditionally have focused on the division of labor between partners as being action oriented, the things you can see, the chores, the doing. But there's this additional layer, which is about the thinking, what you call cognitive labor. And you are inviting us to look at the difference, well, the tension between, the difference between, the interplay between what you call time use and mind use. So can you start us off at the beginning and tell us what drew you to this topic in the first place?
So I was starting my first year graduate school back in 2016, 2017, and I was reading all these books and papers that talked about these gender gaps in household life. And they were quoting, statistics from the mid 20th century through the present. And I found myself quite indignant over what I was reading. I had, I think, what is a common young feminist awakening where it's like, oh, I thought this was a thing that my mom and my grandmother and my great grandmother dealt with, and I thought we fixed this. And so it was sort of, surprising for me to look at those statistics and say, okay, this is still a really big problem where women are.
Because the statistics were showing that there's a huge gender gap.
Yeah, exactly. That women are doing nearly twice as
Mm.
much when it comes to the time they're spending on housework and childcare. And what was even more frustrating for me to read and learn about was that those gaps between men and women hadn't really budged much in more than 20 years. We saw them really converging over the 60s and 70s into the 80s, and then they sort of leveled off, and not much has happened since then. So I had that in the back of my mind. And then at the same time, I had been doing some reading and thinking in the psychology world. And I got introduced to the concept of the bandwidth tax and how when we have a scarcity of any core resource, whether that be time, money, calories, that has these effects on our brain. It causes us to kind of tunnel in on what is most pressing and urgent. And that got me thinking about, well, so much of parenting, so much of household life is not just about the chores that we're doing. It's about the decisions we're making. I was talking with parents at the time who were really struggling with making choices about where to send their kids to school. And I was hearing from them that this was a long process. I was in Boston, and that's a context where you don't necessarily send your kid to the public school down the street. You have a lot of options, for better and for worse. And so parents were telling me, oh, we've got all these spreadsheets, we've done all this research, we've talked to a million people in our social networks who have told us the pros and cons. We're scheduling open houses. And when I dug into that a little bit more, I realized that in cases where it was a different gender couple, she was doing most of that legwork, and then the couple was making the final decision together. And I said, given what we know about bandwidth and scarcity, that has to have some sort of impact on her, right? That she is holding so much in her head. And I went back and I looked at the sociology literature, and there just wasn't a lot about what that hidden work was and how much it cost the primarily women who are doing it. And so then I set out to say, okay, I want to study this in a rigorous way, see what this labor consists of, and understand how couples are sharing or not sharing it.
Something that you point out is that the language that these couples would often use is we. We're researching schools, we have a spreadsheet. But yet, really beneath, if you peel back a layer, it really was she had done the research and she had. What do you make of the fact that the language was a we, even though it was largely until it came time to maybe go to an open house or make a decision, it really had been a she?
A lot of it is that our norms and beliefs about what a good partnership should be, especially among the mostly college educated, upper middle class folks I was interviewing, their norms for marriage had moved toward equality, right? That this was not, his career and her care. Couples really wanted to believe that this was something that they were in together, that they were equal partners. Some of the other research that I have done, I talk about this as the myth of mutuality, right? Our norms really endorse this sense that a good couple should not have a hierarchy and should not put a lot more labor on one partner than the other. And so I think it's an important part of their identity as a couple to say, we are sharing in this work. It is not that she's the parent and I'm just the breadwinner. But what I found was that that was mostly rhetoric rather than reality. That it helped couples to feel like, okay, we are living up to these ideals that we have, even if that wasn't quite what was happening under the surface. It was doing this kind of powerful work of helping them sort of manage the cognitive dissonance of this is how we want to be living
Yes.
as a couple, and
Sure.
here's what we've fallen
Sure.
into for all these reasons.
Is there another part of it that is when the couple looks up their family tree, they can see actual lived ways in which there is more mutuality, more equality than their parents and grandparents? So there's sort of like almost like a grading against a curve sort of a phenomenon. Is that part of it?
I think that's absolutely possible. So, a lot of the couples that I spoke with held up their parents as sort of an anti model for how they wanted to organize their lives. And by many measures, they were doing things differently and more equitably. So, one of the things that I find in my research is that physical labor is it's definitely not 50-50, as the statistics show, but it is closer to. It's in many couples more like 60-40, 65-35. And so it's not that they were totally recreating the patterns of earlier generations. It's a bit of a glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation where I think it's perfectly valid to celebrate the ways that we as a society and we as individual couples have moved toward more mutuality and more equality. And it's tempting to sort of say, all right, we did it, we solved it, we're there, we're equal partners. And so I try to suggest that, okay, both of these things can be true. You can be doing better than your parents on this dimension that's important to you. And you can still have this inequality that might not align with your values.
I want to get into your methodology in a minute because I think it's really fascinating because what you had to do is figure out how the heck you're going to make the invisible visible. And even just this bit that you're giving us now, like I'm imagining our listener and I'm thinking about how that kind of both and also of like there is mutuality here. And what you're inviting our listener, I'm going to say she because most of our listeners are she's, that there may be ways that she is saying that we are more a we than we actually, in terms of the cognitive labor of planning and tracking and organizing and researching is. And so by just shining the light there, it's not about blame, but it's about saying this is so sneaky and maybe 3 layers beneath the surface, and really worth looking at differently. And we'll talk later on in our conversation about, okay, so what the heck do we do about this? But I think it's so important that you're illuminating something that is otherwise invisible, that kind of hides out under this veneer of we're researching schools.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that I find really tricky when I talk to couples about this is that these are sort of stories that help keep the peace. And they are stories that help couples to often feel better about how they're doing things to avoid conflict. And so my goal is not to go in and to say, you're deluded, let me pull back the curtain and show you what's really happening. I think these stories that we tell ourselves about equality and mutuality have an important function in relationships. And many couples also have these deep values and these a deep sense in which they want to feel fulfilled in both their professional and their home lives. Right. And so I think that sometimes these stories, while they might help eliminate some tension in the moment, can create longer term problems that can build and lead to resentment.
That is for sure. Okay, so talk to us a little bit about the question you were trying to answer and then how you designed research to try to get to this question of like, okay, we're not tracking the behaviors of who's doing what. We're tracking the thinking that is going into each partner across a day, a week, a month. So tell us a little bit about how you got to that with your research.
So I started out kind of looking at the model of time use research. So when we talk about the statistics around what men and women do for their households, oftentimes that is drawn on time surveys where people keep track of, okay, from 2:03 to 2:10 p.m. I was, showering. From 2:10 to 2:20, I was tucking my daughter in for a nap, et cetera, et cetera. And what I realized is we could use some of those tools, but slightly change the questions So I call this, time use versus mind use. What were you thinking about from 2:03 to 2:10? And in particular, what decisions were you making? My hypothesis was that decisions would be the most salient piece of this process because often decisions are tied to some sort of action, right? I've decided that we're going to have spaghetti for dinner. Therefore, I can move forward with cooking. Or I've decided that I'm going to send my daughter to this particular daycare. So I should call to schedule. And so by asking people to, for about 24 hours, keep what I called a decision log or decision diary, where they tracked all the decisions they were making, or even just thinking about, because sometimes decisions take a while. You might be wondering about where to go on vacation this summer, but not get to a final decision. I had people log that for a day. And then when I sat down with them for the interview, they handed me their log and we could talk through. And they might say, okay, we decided we are going to take a trip to California. And I would say, tell me about how you got there. How did this conversation come up in this moment? Did you, nudge your spouse and say, hey, summer's coming, we've got to decide this. Was this something that, you normally handle? So I would have all these detailed questions to try and unpack what had led to that decision moment.
Yep.
And that was really telling for who does the research, who tends to initiate these conversations, who tends to follow up to make sure whatever we said we were going to do actually happened. And by kind of painstakingly putting together all of these little examples, I was able to paint a picture of, okay, when it comes to food decisions, she is usually the person driving things forward. Maybe when it comes to financial decisions, he's the one driving things forward. But I could look across the different areas of their life and say, generally speaking, most of this cognitive work, most of this anticipating, researching, deciding is falling on her in the majority of different gender couples.
So my understanding is you ended up with basically 5 types of couples: woman-led in the straight couples, man-led in the straight couples, balanced in the straight couples, and then either balanced or imbalanced in your queer couples. Is that a fair way of
That's exactly
saying
right.
it? Mm-hmm. So tell us what stands out to you about, like, what do we need to know and keep in mind about the woman-led couples? I also want to then kind of like juxtaposition those to like these kind of subversive ones, like either your balanced straight couples or your man-led straight couples. So just kind of paint us a picture for the woman-led couples. What did you see? What were the stories? What was the emotional impact?
So, numbers wise, about 80% of the different gender couples that I interviewed were these woman led couples where she is carrying the bulk of the cognitive labor, the mental load, as it's sometimes called, for her family. Another 20% were, roughly evenly split, 10% balanced and 10% man led. So, with these woman led couples, what would often happen would be that she was sort of like the air traffic controller for the family. She was constantly scanning the horizon, looking at the calendar, thinking about the time of year, and noticing what her children were doing. I should say that these were all parents who I interviewed for this project, and she was in charge of sort of saying, "Here are the things that we need to be worried about, or the things that we need to be thinking about as a couple and as a family." And then, depending on the area of life, right? So, if it was something like children's extracurriculars, something like planning a family gathering, she would then go to research mode, right? And she would either, ask her friends, okay, what's the best swim academy around here? She would get on the phone with the extended family and, okay, who's bringing what for Thanksgiving? And do this sort of background work to kind of set things up, leading to a decision stage. And what I found was that most of these couples were not making unilateral decisions. Right? If it was anything that involved some significant outlay of time or resources or an important something for their family, then she would bring it to him and she would say, "Hey, I think we should sign Johnny up for this particular soccer league. What do you think about that?" And they might have a conversation. He might say, actually, I think Johnny would do better in, swimming, right? And then she might go back to the drawing board. But she was almost as like a project manager moving these things forward. And then once a decision had been made, she would be the one monitoring and following up to say, okay, you said, husband, that you were going to call so and so to make this arrangement. Have you actually called them? Or, we decided we were going to sign Johnny up for soccer, and it turns out he hates soccer. Are we going to revisit this decision and find something different? Right. And so once the decision had been made and the action had been taken, her work was not necessarily done. And what I saw was that women really experienced this. One of my interviewees called this a constant background job in her head. She came from the world of software development, right? And so this is a term that suggests when a computer is sort of constantly running something in the background. She said, that's what it feels like. I am never just in the moment. I am always kind of pinging from one thing to another. Oh, what about this? What about that? And while we all are familiar with the pings of our smartphones, and many of us, myself included, try to take steps to minimize their intrusiveness, you can't do that when those pings are coming from inside your brain. And so a lot of women experience this as a constant burden and always onness that over time, I think, led to exhaustion, stress, burnout, etc.
And less time for obviously hobbies, but also political activism, volunteerism, like sort of being out and engaged in the world, which is another impact.
Yeah, absolutely. This is recent research by a scholar I believe she's in the UK, who has found that when someone is involved in more cognitive labor in their household, they're actually less politically engaged, right? So it's not just our own individual well-being that is affected. It goes much beyond it to our civic fabric and the ability for anyone, but especially women, to participate in that way.
Very hard to organize a revolution when you are trying to figure out swim lessons and camp and all of that. Yes.
Exactly.
It's convenient. Okay. So you've got this 10% and 10% of the man-led couples and the balanced couples. Like how do they describe what they were doing differently? And did they know they were doing something differently? Like, well, I'm really curious, like what the story was that supported their subversion of the kind of dominant paradigm.
This was really fascinating to me. I sort of knew that there wouldn't be one single formula, right? That it would probably be a number of different pathways people took toward, man-led or balanced arrangements. But I noticed a few things. One was that a lot of couples did not really intend to be subversive, did not intend to kind of revolutionize gender norms. It was rather a series of circumstances, often tied to their respective careers, that sort of opened up new pathways, and they responded flexibly. Right? Many of them told me this wasn't necessarily what I pictured, but often it would be, her career really took off, and I saw how engaged she was in that work. And mine is it's fine as it is, right? I don't have that same drive that she has, and so I have stepped up in these ways to allow her to lean in at work. That kind of narrative was common. The other sort of more intentional pathway, I don't think they necessarily had particularly unique, they were not radical feminists for the most part. It was much more personal. So I think of a woman I call Carrie in the book, and her interview was one of the most memorable. She really had this strong visceral sense that she did not want the relationship that her parents had. She sort of saw the way that her parents were very gender traditional. She told me the story about how her mom asked her dad to go to the grocery store on Thanksgiving morning because she had forgotten some things, and he wanted to bring his daughter with him to help him. She was like, he can read, he knows his way around a grocery store,
Full-grown man.
and just had this very strong, like, no, this is not what I want. And when she entered the relationship with the man who would eventually be her husband, that was very much kind of the way that she set the terms and said, I haven't seen this marriage thing to be super great for women. I haven't seen this parenthood thing to be super great for women. If we're going to do this, it's going to have to be something different. So that really set the tone for how they made decisions at key turning points in their lives. They were, both in college together, and then had to decide where to go after they graduated. They had to figure out when to move and when to stay for their careers. They had to figure out the timing of parenthood and how all that would happen. And throughout, there was this orientation of our careers are equally important. There's no presumption that she would be the primary cognitive laborer or physical labor for that matter, right? They had a different model in mind and were really intentionally working toward that over the course of their many years together.
What's so important about their story to me is that they held on to the two tracks, that we are going to be intentional about the physical labor and the cognitive labor. I think that's it's why we need the mental load and the invisible labor and the cognitive load. It's why we need the language for that so that we can track it, right? Because even I'm thinking about even a man who's been socialized in such a way where he really wants to do it differently, the cognitive labor is invisible. So it needs to be brought to the surface. And so I hear in that story of that couple, they really were intentional about surfacing, okay, if we're going to do this the way that we want to do it to transform the models we saw growing up, we're going to have a way to make sure we're sharing not just the doing, but the thinking. That's really important.
Absolutely. And I always like to say when I talk about these couples that they faced an uphill battle.
Oh, yeah. There's some mother-in-laws weighing in.
Exactly. So in that same interview with Carrie, she told me a story about how she was a scientist and she was on a work trip, and someone, at a dinner asked her, well, where are your kids right now? Who's feeding them? And she had to be like, the same person who always feeds them. I have no culinary skills and no desire to build those skills. And so there are all these subtle moments where the couples would get the message that what they were doing was not normal. And they had to be really strong in their conviction that that was what would work best for them.
Yeah, it's great. I think that when the couples I have met who have done that and done it well, it ends up being another road to intimacy, is like, this is us. Like, this is another way that we define us and we declare who we are and we stay connected to each other because we have this commitment to walking our talk. So I think you're wise to highlight that there needs to be a commitment, but also that the commitment is a connecting one for the two people who are doing it.
Absolutely.
I was thinking about your subset of couples where they kind of fall into it based on career trajectories. When I'm working with a couple in therapy like that, you use the word flexible. This was a couple where life threw them some curveballs. It made more sense to have him taking more responsibility at home, and they flexibly adapted to it. And I think that so often couples end up in my office because they're in that circumstance, but they're resisting it and they're pushing against it. And she is trying to be the killer badass at work and not let go of a single thing at home. And I think there's something very deep for a woman sometimes around letting, like, if he's planning the birthday party, if he is the room parent, it feels like a loss, certainly, but also a vulnerability around who I am as a woman and who I am as a mother. And I wonder if you saw and encountered that in your research as well.
I think the pattern that really speaks to exactly what you're talking about with the birthday party example is that even among the balanced and man-led different gender couples, what I saw was that she almost always held on to those sorts of managing my children's relationship with the external world. She was still primarily the person who was doing the birthday parties and, being the room parent. Not always, there were some exceptions, but I think that was a way that she felt like this is uniquely valuable and important to me. And also, on some level, recognized that women are still held accountable, right? Our identity as women, and especially as mothers, I'm experiencing this now. We are supposed to be the ones who know our children best, who are best able to comfort them and shepherd them. And I think that these couples found ways to divide and conquer, where he was still doing most of the cognitive work, but she held on to this area because it's so tied to our societal ideals about femininity and motherhood in particular.
There's something very sweet then for a man who's able to be like, okay, that's yours. Even though I'm here, even though I'm deeply, deeply in the trenches, you get to have that one. Yeah, because there's no world in which that's not the backdrop against, all of that socialization is the backdrop against what this happens, which is why I want you to talk a little bit about the personal essentialism and the gender essentialism, because that was a really key through line about how couples made sense of the imbalance.
This is my favorite part of the book, so I'm glad
Okay,
you're
good.
highlighting
Okay,
it.
good. Go for it.
So listeners may be familiar with the idea of gender essentialism being the sense that this belief that men and women are inherently or innately different in some way. So the classic example is this: men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or maybe vice versa, right? Where men like sports, men are more oriented toward machines and things. Women like fashion, are more oriented toward people. We have all of these stereotypes that are based on our sense that these are essential differences between the genders. And that, at least for the couples that I interviewed, was not very common, right? I heard it occasionally, but they, for the most part, were not saying things like, oh, she does that because she's a woman and women do X. He does that because he's a man and men do Y. What they said to me was, she's got this particular personality. She is a really organized person. She is, maybe a little neurotic. The word control freak came up a number of times. And
superhero.
Yeah, exactly. She's super mom. And so I call this the superhuman archetype, where we paint this picture of a person who is just inherently on top of things. She's got it covered. And then on the flip side, the other archetype that came up over and over was what I call the bumbler, where he's laid back, he's go with the flow, he just doesn't notice these things. And it was framed in personal terms. It was about, here's a difference between me and my spouse. I'm type A, he's type B, or whatever the opposite of type A is. And my job as a sociologist is to look at that and say, wait a minute, how come all of the women are being labeled type A and all of the men?
Weird how that keeps happening.
And so I actually went into the psychology literature to be like, is this just a super ingrained gender difference in personality? And you might know more about this, but what I read was that, okay, there are some marginal differences in the big 5 personality traits by gender, but nowhere near big enough to explain the kinds of patterns that I was seeing. And so what I ended up finding was that this is a form of personal essentialism, where couples are saying, we as 2 individuals are innately different. Not about gender, it's about me and him, or me and her. And the problem was that they were just basically copy pasting gender stereotypes, but relabeling them as individual difference. And that was something that, to our point earlier, enabled them to feel like we are not doing things the way that our parents did. We are not one of those traditional couples. But because they were relying in this really sneaky way on gender ideas, they ended up recreating them in their own relationships.
It's so, Allison, it's my favorite part of your research too. It's so, like, when I read that part, I could feel the little hairs on my neck stand up. I was like, yes, that just puts about 8 pieces, in place inside of my brain in terms of how I think about this and experience this. It's so subtle the way you're helping us think about how we make these stories to make things make sense. And we're missing how we're calling it me versus you. And really that's what it feels like, right? Like that's actually the phenomenological way that it feels. It doesn't feel like a cop out. It doesn't feel like we're gaslighting ourselves and each other. It actually is how it feels. And you are inviting us, not to beat ourselves up, but just to say, listen, I'm seeing this across the board. And there's a way in which we are making personal something that is actually pretty baked in the gender socialization.
One of my goals in this book was to really write as openly as and honestly as I could about these patterns without trying to put blame on individual couples.
Of course. It's all too big for blame. It's
Exactly.
all too big for blame.
And I try to kind of say, this is not, sure, there are people out there with bad intentions, but most of what I saw was people of all genders who were trying their best, who cared about their partners, wanted to be in a mutually fulfilling relationship. And there are a number of factors and forces that were working against them, right? And so by saying, oh, it's about our personality, that was a way that they could kind of let themselves be okay with, hey, it's an uphill battle to try and do things differently. We've fallen into this gender traditional pattern, but we don't necessarily want to talk about that. And so I think that the next move is if you recognize yourself doing this, oh, it's just about our personalities, then to say, what if we thought of this as a set of skills rather than traits? What if we said, it's not that she was born knowing how to manage a calendar for a family with lots of activities? What if this is a skill that she has been socialized and encouraged to develop over time and to apply to her family? So when we think of these as skills rather than traits, I think that makes me at least more hopeful that these are not patterns that necessarily are unchangeable, which is how so many couples felt about it. We can move away from personality and towards skill. I think that opens up new possibilities.
Well, and don't you also say that for somebody who is kind of falling into that bumbler archetype, there very likely are some things that some ways you could look at other parts of your life, who you are at work, what you manage at work, the way that you plan and execute and track projects at work, those are skills that you have. You just are not practiced in bringing those skills to a domestic realm, right? So it may even be that those skills are there. They just haven't been brought into this sphere.
That's absolutely right. So one of the things that I found really striking was how differently men would talk about their professional lives and their personal lives. And the focus of our conversation, our interview was really about their home lives. But through that, I would ask them about their work, about their career trajectory. And many of these men were in very high powered positions that require a lot of organization, strategic thinking, forethought. And I would sometimes ask them, oh, it seems like you're really good about this.
You're not a bumbler. You're not much of a bumbler.
Exactly. And, I have one conversation that's coming to mind where he said, yeah, I'm exhausted by the time I get home. I don't have anything left over after I've done, I believe he was a pediatric surgeon. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But women didn't have that choice, or we're not giving themselves that choice, because the buck stops with women when it comes to our children's well-being, the state of our homes, how connected we are to our networks. And so men were sort of able to say, well, I used that up on the job. And most women, at least in my sample, didn't have that option. So this was not the point of my interviews, but I think if I were doing it from a more therapeutic coaching perspective, I would encourage that surgeon to say, it seems like you could plan complex literal operations, right? How might you take some of those things that you've learned to do in your workplace? Where might they be applicable at home, if that's something that you want to pursue?
I know that you are a huge fan of Eve Rodsky's work as well, and that you recommend her fair play methodology. But it reminds me of that part of her work where she talks about we treat women's time like sand and men's time like diamonds. And there is that kind of preciousness of he's exhausted, that the time is limited, but the assumption is that she's got another kind of tank that she can, energetic tank that she can just kind of strap on when she gets home and kind of keep powering through. Yeah. Two more things I want to ask you before we wrap up. One is I would love for you to talk a bit about your queer couples and your study and what you found there in terms of the imbalanced ones. How do they make sense of the imbalance, and the balanced ones? How are they also kind of finding ways to be mindful and intentional together?
Yeah, so I did this research process happened in several phases. And after I had done a couple phases of interviews with straight couples, I would get a lot of questions from people when I would give talks. How do you think this would be different if the partner shared the same gender, or, were queer in some way and not subject to the same heteronormative strictures? And so I was like, I don't know. I'm going to find out. And so I recruited a sample. It's mostly same gender, gay and lesbian couples, but I call them queer couples because there were also some non-binary and trans folks in there who don't really map neatly onto that framework. And I think it's a bit of a myth among folks who are themselves heterosexual that, oh, queer couples must just, have everything equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not subject to these same norms and
they're free.
Exactly. And that's sort of a yes and no, at least in my research. What I saw was that they were much less likely to have the huge gaps in cognitive labor that I saw among straight couples, right? If in straight couples it was more like 80-20, it would be more like 60-40 or 55-45 for queer couples. But most of them did have some level of imbalance in the way that they divided up cognitive labor. Now, in addition to it being a smaller gap overall, I think the thing that really struck me was they were talking with their partner about those dynamics in a way that wasn't really the case, not for every straight couple, but for most straight couples. They would say, "Oh, yeah, we've chatted about this," or, "Oh, we shared this article that was going around. I do this part in our relationship. She does that part in our relationship." So it was something that they were making sense of together and felt like they had some agency over, right? That, yeah, we acknowledge it, but it's working for us. It wasn't every queer couple. I talked about some who did have a lot of conflict over these issues, but in most cases, it was something that they were in frequent conversation about and felt like we could change this if we needed to. And I think part of why there was less conflict, in addition to them talking about it, was that they weren't falling into a sort of male female role. It wasn't that one partner, regardless of gender, would play the kind of chief cognitive labor role and the other would play the chief breadwinner role. Much more often, they would kind of mix and match in these idiosyncratic ways that I think reflected their unique circumstances, their unique preferences. They were not defaulting into this prescribed bundle that goes with being a man or being a woman. And some queer couples that I interviewed talked about that as a real privilege. They felt like, yes, it is really nice that we don't have these defaults. We have to decide.
Right. It's not tied to the body. It's not tied to identity. So it makes it a little bit more, there's a little bit of space between who I am and what I do. And it makes it a little more malleable.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no, and especially this was especially true for gay male couples. They would say neither one of us was the carried the child, neither one of us birthed this child. And so for them in particular, they felt like there's no default here. There's no role. We have to create all of this from the start. And that, depending on how you look at it, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of communication and discussion. Or it's a privilege to be able to choose for yourself with not quite a blank slate, but fewer societal expectations to tell you how things should be done.
Okay, now I have two more things because I just thought of something else. One is I was really struck when you write about how, physical labor when children are very young is really intense. And maybe, shrinks over time as kids become a bit more independent. But cognitive labor actually, if anything, grows as kids are in the school years and the adolescent years. And I was so struck by that because it was making me think about my husband and I, who now are the parents of college students. And I did the bulk of the physical labor and the bulk of the cognitive labor when the kids were young and really throughout their teen-ish years. But as they've entered college, my husband takes on so much cognitive labor now around budgeting, planning for travel, logistics, cars, insurance. There's just like there's so much more that he carries in terms of the decision-making, cognitive, checking in and managing than I do. It's really interesting. So I think that your couples were on the younger side, but I'm just planting the seed for your future research would be to track how this changes over the course of a couple's journey raising a family, because it feels very different to me now than it did for us at any other point along the way.
I'm so curious about that. Do you have a sense of why that switch has happened for you?
I think because I've always been the one who's been hands-on, all of my cognitive stuff is around managing the things that have to do with food, clothing, medical appointments, like the things that are very tangible, very here and now. And he's been much more in charge of the finances of our home throughout. And so now that the financial stuff bleeds into cell phones and cars and health insurance, I think his scope of work has expanded. He's in conversation with them about budgets and leases and all these kinds of things that I'm not really involved in those conversations at all, which is actually so delightful for me to kind of watch. It's really nice to see him carrying our family in his mind differently than he did in the earlier years.
Yeah, so it's almost as if you're sort of areas of responsibility have stayed the same, but the size of the pie has shifted over time as your kids age, as their life circumstances shift.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And then the last thing is I was glad that you addressed the way in which the macro factors around stagnating wages, inadequate childcare, like the sort of the risk of gun violence here in the US, like the way that these macro factors affect and burden individual families so much, right? So there's part of the reason you need to do so much research is that there isn't reliable, readily accessible, community level childcare. So it's a bigger job. So I think that was really important for you to highlight the ways in which when the systems, the societal policy level systems aren't family friendly, aren't family focused, it puts that much more responsibility on each individual household. And I wonder if you could speak to that part a little bit for us.
I think that I'm so glad that we've collectively been talking more about mental load and gender inequality in households. Even over the last 5 years, I think the pandemic really sparked a lot of these conversations. That has been so wonderful to see, and I'm all for it. And I think that sometimes we focus a little too much on he needs to do more, he needs to step up, she needs to let him take on more. These sort of interpersonal dynamics, which are important, but miss the fact that our society puts so much onto individual households. We're more isolated in our nuclear families than ever before. We have parenting norms that seem to ratchet upward with every year. And so just the collective amount that a household needs to hold is really a lot. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that yes, we can reduce women's mental load by encouraging men to do more and to share that work more equitably. But I think we can get a lot more bang for our buck by saying, do we need to make it so difficult to patch together childcare? Right? If you think about the standard employment schedule and how that does not map at all onto the school calendar, right? There's summer break, there's aftercare, there's in-service days. That generates a ton of cognitive labor that primarily women are taking on. So what I try to encourage us in the conclusion to do is to really think about what can we as schools, as employers, as daycare centers, and as policymakers and people who can influence policy, how can we think about reducing the overall workload that families have to manage? And then families can reallocate within the nuclear family as they see fit. But I think we need both pieces if we're going to really get at this problem.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that fits with what when you write about what can a couple do about all this, you suggest depersonalizing the struggle and like recognizing how gender socialization shapes you. And then you do this part about the splitters and the sharers, like to start to look at like what are the individual and couple goals that we have. Will you just tell us a little bit about the splitters versus the sharers?
Yeah, that was a really interesting finding where I sort of found that there were kind of two ways that a couple could allocate work, right? A couple could achieve balance by saying, hey, I'm going to handle cooking and maintenance and shopping, and you're going to handle travel planning and childcare planning and yard work, right? We could split things up in that way. And some couples did that very effectively. Other couples were sharers, and they said, you know what? We don't want to divide and conquer. We want this to feel like we're in each area ourselves. And that could be as simple as we both decide what's for dinner. We have a conversation or we take turns. And I think both paths can be productive depending on how they're framed. So some people were sharers, I think, because there wasn't a lot of trust, and they both wanted to be involved because they didn't trust their spouse to do it independently. But the more positive kind is when, hey, we're invested in this together. We do not have these necessarily rigid roles. We are flexible, and this is a shared project that we're working on together. And those couples tended to be a bit happier.
Yeah, yeah. And then for couples where, if somebody's listening and they are recognizing how much imbalance there is in the cognitive load, you would advise them to like start small and maybe start with some reallocation that is more within the house and private versus starting by handing over the birthday party, which is something that's very public. Like what does that look like for a couple to start small with making some of these shifts?
I think there's a tendency to, once you notice a problem, to totally overhaul everything to try and fix it. And I recommend starting small because I think that there are just so many factors at play here. So a lot of cognitive labor is in part relational, right? One person has built up relationships with the child's teacher, with other parents in the neighborhood. One parent has, been to all the other birthday parties. And so these are things that are very hard to just flip a switch overnight. These are, as we said earlier, skills that take time and practice, and some, stumbles usually to get right. And so I think couples will set themselves up for more success by sort of working with rather than against those forces and saying, hey, what is something that I'm thinking of your female listener, right? What is something that I am currently holding that needs to be done, but isn't something that I would feel so stressed about not being done in a particular way or not being done in a particular timeline.
Right.
For me and in my relationship, I would like to make sure that we have a functioning car, but the oil change calendar is not going to be pinging in my brain. I am not going to be driving past a car wash and thinking, oh, we should wash it. For a whole number of reasons, that's just something that was much easier for my husband and me to say. You are going to own everything. You're going to take the car to the car wash. You're going to remember the schedule. You're going to research mechanics. So it's recognizing that, we have preferences. They may be built on gender socialization, but we don't have to totally erase those. We can work with them in ways and find opportunities where it's not going to be such a painful process where one person is sitting on their hands and saying, oh, will he do that? Won't he do that? Right? Think about areas that you're currently holding it, but you would be okay with someone else taking that on. Start there, build momentum, and hopefully that will eventually lead to some positive change and kind of proof of concept where you say, oh, we are not stuck in these particular patterns. We can.
Yeah, change is possible.
Right? Exactly.
If we're thinking about her letting go of something and handing it over to him and and he's really agreeing to take it from start to finish, I would also want her to really notice, what does she do at that time instead? Like really noticing, like, what did I do? I wrote in my journal or took a nap or called a friend. Like, what did you do? When you got that time back, what did you do instead? I think that's part of the reinforcing. It's not just him doing it well enough that, but it also is like her recognizing the value of what she was able to then put in that little window.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah. What are you gaining by letting this, piece of your brain that's been revving on a particular topic? What space does that make for something else?
What revolution are you going to begin now?
Exactly. We need more of those.
That's right. Oh, this was so fun, Allison. You are a wealth of knowledge and just excellent at helping us think about this differently. And I'm so grateful for the good work that you've done and the book that you've put together, What's on Her Mind. So tell us how people can connect with you and learn more about you. We'll have links to the book in the show notes. What else do you want people to know?
Absolutely. So the book is on my website at AllisonDaminger.com. I also write a Substack newsletter where I try to look at the intersection between gender roles and family life. That's called the Daminger Dispatch, and it's linked on my website on the homepage. I'm not really on much other social media these days, so those are the places that I'll be easiest to track down.
That's wonderful. Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Allison, for that rich and insightful conversation. It was so fun to dig into such a meaty topic with a fellow research lover. Yes, we are making huge strides in terms of doing things differently than our parents' generation, but it does not mean we're totally there yet. There are, however, couples out there who've broken the mold, whether that was circumstantial or through very intentional dividing and conquering as a team, which means it is entirely possible for all of us to achieve a fairer division of cognitive labor. I hope this conversation inspires you to consider the division of labor in your home and work as a team with your partner to split it up more evenly, to stave off resentment and exhaustion, and to foster more connection. Until next time, be well. Thank you for listening to our show. Our producers are Mary Chan and Katie Pagich of Organized Sound Productions. Our theme music was composed by Slade Warnkin. The show is executive produced by me, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.